This film is about you and everyone you know. 56% of Canadians over 75 are disabled. The majority of Canadians will live into their 80s. This means you or someone close to you are likely to get a disability. Eileen, Paul Kahn's mother.
He was about 5 years old, and we were on holidays we're on holidays in Suez, and he started to complain about his eyes, and I thought it was the sand, but it wasn't. And we took him to the emergency there, and the doctors told us to see a doctor as soon as we get home, and that was the start of all his problems.
The renewal and patriation of our Constitution. But let us put our faith.
The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees every citizen equal protection and equal benefit under the law. But most of Canada's citizens with disabilities do not have a practical way to enforce the civil rights guaranteed to them by the Charter.
Canadians everywhere in sharing this day of national achievement.
Don Renault, lawyer.
So a right without a remedy is no right at all. It's all well and good for the law to say that you have a right to freedom of speech, or you have a right to security of the person, you have a right to not be hurt or harmed by somebody else. But if there's no enforcement of that right, then you really don't have a right at all.
Not having a way to enforce your civil rights determines where you live.
Well, because when Paul was that young, at the stage of a baby, and a very young boy, he had no problems one way or the other.
Ute Valdis, Paul Kahn's father.
He was just a regular little boy until he was about around 5 years old. He had problems with eyes, and when that was looked into and studied, they discovered that he had, of course, the other muscular problem. But it wasn't all that impossible at that stage. He still went to school, went through elementary school, and then they started to show up more. One of his feet would not function as well. And then it became more pronounced in his ability to walk when he was going through high school.
Paul Kahn.
I became aware as a boy that my disability would get worse as I got older. But I never imagined that one day I would have to use a wheelchair, or that one day I would be dependent on a ventilator.
In 2005, Paul Kahn got a chest infection and had to be admitted to hospital. After 6 months in the hospital, the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority told him he had to live in a nursing home. This is what happened when Paul refused to live in the nursing home.
The day came when I was technically, officially discharged from the hospital. The health authority expected me to go to the nursing home, and I refused. So what the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority did is they called the RCMP, and I was in my bed, which I can't get out of on my own, attached to my ventilator, when two RCMP officers entered my room. To the credit of the Mounties, one of them was quoted in local newspaper the next day, because the press found out what had happened, and it caused a big an uproar in the press. And one of the Mounties, I think it might have been the older Mountie who came to my room, he was quoted in the press as saying that he believed that the Mounties had been called by the health authority to put leverage on me. In addition to calling in the Mounties, also tried to bribe me. They offered me a deal at the same time that the coercion was going on. The classic case of the carrot and the stick. And the carrot was, if I consented to go to Pearson, how long would I be willing to wait there if they promised to get me a place to live in my home community? I consented to go to Pearson after only receiving a written agreement from the CEO of the health authority at that time that within a 2-year period they would get me a place to live in my home community. If I had known exactly what was going to happen very soon after I started to live at Pearson, I would never have agreed to such a deal.
Not having a way to enforce your civil rights makes you vulnerable. Tim Stainton is the director of the University of British Columbia's School of Social Work. He has published numerous books and articles on disability history. One of his 6 children has a disability.
Well, I think the evidence about abuse in institutions is pretty strong from a couple of perspectives. That I think, on the one hand, not just in Canada or contemporary, that you can go back as far as the earliest institutions, and really, pretty well any time anybody has bothered to look deep enough or scratch the surface, they've found evidence of abuse, and that goes right back to the very first institution for people with intellectual disabilities in Switzerland, a place called Aubenberg, back in the mid-19th century. And that pattern's been pretty consistently repeated across countries, across eras, across jurisdictions, and across populations. You know, it's nothing particular with disability, but it does seem to be something inherent in institutions themselves, whether they're for the elderly, people with disabilities, for children, residential schools. So I would say the evidence is pretty compelling that there is something in the nature of an institution that tends to engender abuse.
Rita McDonald is the daughter of Gary Davies, who worked as a postal carrier for most of his life. Sarah is Rita's daughter, Gary's granddaughter.
My dad was a man that grew up in East Van all his life. His name was Gary William Davis. He worked as a post office letter carrier for 23 years. He was a good man, and I loved him dearly. So my dad had a disability when he was 18. He was given shock treatment, but growing up with my dad, he never had any outbursts. My dad was in the hospital on April 2006 from an aneurysm in his groin. From there, I learned that he had a bed sore, but instead of helping Dad at the time, they decided to put him into long-term care facility. While there, I was told and reassured that he was going to get the best care, best nutrition, best everything. He didn't. He got neglected. He got starved. I got to see the bed sore. I was naive at the time, thinking the bed sores were tiny, but they weren't. It wasn't. It went right down to his spine. It was black. It was. You could see everything, all his organs in the back, and the doctor at emergency said that, well, we can let it run its course, or we can do a skin graft. My dad reached out to me and said, "Don't let me die. I want to live." And so we got the skin graft, and he survived that, only to be put in a care facility that didn't really care. And then a month later, he had his operation to get his bed sores on his legs removed, so he had to amputate the legs from bed sores.
I think that the reason why this should be a lot more broadcast is the fact that this can happen to anybody. It could happen to you, someone that you love. It could happen to me, my mom. It happened to my grandfather. And I mean, you don't want any of this to happen because we're all people. This can happen to absolutely anybody. I don't see the fairness in that. I mean, I was young when it happened to me, and I knew it was wrong. I mean, any age should know how wrong this is. It doesn't matter how old you are. You are a person. You don't deserve this. Nobody does, and this needs to stop. This really does.
The Ministry of Health does not require care staff to report information indicating seniors receiving residential care services are being abused or neglected. BC Ombudsperson, 2012. Dick Sobsey is the recently retired professor of educational psychology at the University of Alberta. He is the author of the 1994 book, Violence and Abuse in the Lives of People with Disabilities. He has a son with a disability.
People with disabilities in general, Canadians with disabilities, are about 1.5 times as likely to be victims of violence as other Canadians. There's more than one pattern that we see with perpetrators. One of those patterns would be what I would call predatory offenders, and these are people who deliberately select into jobs or situations where they can access vulnerable people. So in some ways, these might be people who take a job as a disabled transportation provider or a personal care attendant, already knowing that they want to have that power over other people and maybe already thinking that they're going to sexually or physically abuse people. The other would be more what we refer to as corrupted offenders, and these are people who come into the system without really thinking that they're going to perpetrate any kind of abuse. But once they're in the circumstance and they experience the power imbalances, they experience frustration, then maybe they experience other role models, other caregivers who are abusive. Under those circumstances, their behavior gradually deteriorates until they become abusive, whether that's sexually abusive or physically abusive or just emotionally abusive. In fact, what we discover is that in many cases where we uncover abusive caregivers, they have many, many victims. So if you assume that one caregiver might in fact abuse 20 people or 40 people or 100 people, it doesn't take a lot of abusive caregivers to produce a lot of abused people.
The Ministry of Health does not require service providers to notify the police of an incident of abuse or neglect that may constitute a criminal offense. Brian Tardif is the Executive Director of Citizen Advocacy in Ottawa. Citizen Advocacy supports people with a wide range of disabilities.
There were 6 people, all of whom had lived in one of our institutions for many years. With the help of many people in the community, were able to move out. So I wanted to know how they would feel if, for some reason, they had to go back there. The first person to respond to my question said, I'd probably kill myself. And then that was what you heard from everybody who was part of that conversation.
Not having a way to enforce your civil rights means the government can do anything to you.
When I had been in the news, in the hospital, a casual acquaintance of mine, who's a person with a disability, had contacted me asking to help me. We were having a telephone conversation. We had a disagreement, and he reacted to our disagreement by threatening to kill me. And this set in motion a series of bizarre events that one day led to, I went to my room, and there was this polite man in my room in his early 40s who introduced himself as a psychiatrist. And he wanted to know how I was doing. And I told him I wasn't doing too very well. I'd recently been forced into Pearson from my community. I had pneumonia at the time, etc. Me about the man who had threatened to kill me, who had been banned from the side of Pearson. And I told him the background, and I had contacted the police, and I played in some of the voicemails, harassing voicemails from the man. And at the end of this 45 minutes, the psychiatrist asked me if I was having any trouble sleeping. And I think people can understand I was actually having a little trouble sleeping at the time, at that time. And he said, well, how about I give you something to help you sleep? And I thought it was a generic sleeping pill, and I said yes. He went. And then after 3 weeks, I stopped taking it, thinking it was not prudent to take sleeping pills every night, and I slept fine. And many weeks after this, the psychiatrist came to my room, and as soon as he entered my room, he was obviously, I could tell, he was angry. He was, by his body language. And he started to demand that I go back on the medication that, as far as I knew, was simply to help me sleep, that I had stopped taking, and I refused. Simply, I was baffled by his insistency. And I kept saying, well, I'm sleeping fine, so I don't need to take a sleeping pill because I haven't used it for weeks and I slept fine. And he kept insisting, and I kept saying no. And I had found out that the medication that I had been on was an antipsychotic. A little light bulb went off and I said, Dr. So-and-so, I don't need to take I don't need to take psychotropic drugs because, thinking I was very clever when I said this, I don't have a mental illness. And the psychiatrist said in response, yes, you do. And I was baffled, and I said, I do? What? And he says, you have a paranoid delusional disorder. I do? About what? He said that so-and-so threatened to kill you. And then I got extremely frightened. And he said, if I hear about you doing anything else weird, that was his word, about the man who had threatened to kill me, I will have you committed under the Mental Health Act.
Not having a way to enforce your civil rights determines how you live. Barb Westfield.
I got moved into when I was 10.
The Woodlands School, originally called the Provincial Asylum for the Criminally Insane, jailed people with disabilities in British Columbia from 1878 until 1996.
No, not good. Not good at all. It's not very nice there. It's not good. It's like a petition. You're not allowed to go anywhere. You're not allowed to do anything. You're not allowed to go out. You're not allowed to. You're not allowed to move. You stay in one spot all the time. All the time you stay in one area, and no other place. They have to be where you gotta be. And the food is awful. And it's not nice at all with them. Not nice at all.
Now, last year you watched Woodlands being demolished.
Are you kidding me? I did.
Details of physical abuse found in the records of Woodlands include hitting, kicking, smacking, slapping, striking, restraining, isolating, grabbing by the hair or limbs, dragging, pushing onto a table, kicking and shoving, very cold showers and very hot baths resulting in burns to the skin, verbal abuse including swearing, bullying and belittling, inappropriate conduct such as extended isolation, wearing shackles, and wearing a belt leash with documented evidence of the injuries including bruises, scratches, broken limbs, black eyes, and a swollen face. The sexual abuse included assault, intercourse, and in the result, injuries and in a few cases a pregnancy. From the 2001 report, The Need to Know. Barb lived in Woodlands for 30 years.
1977, I moved out of Woodlands. Then I went to Pearson in 1977.
Opened in 1952 as a hospital for people with tuberculosis, since 1965, Vancouver, British Columbia's George Pearson Centre has housed adults with disabilities.
What was George Pearson like?
Same thing. You can't go nowhere. You're not allowed to do anything. Pearson was the same.
Can you tell me how you got out of Pearson?
Yes, I will. I from karma, and I helped my roommate Veronica to get out of there too. So I got Veronica out of there, so we both got out. She was not happy. She was crying her eyes out. I heard somebody telling her to stop. She didn't feel very safe there, so I thought I would take her out of there. I got her out of there. I was glad to get more people out of there.
Barb lived in George Pearson Centre for 20 years.
Why didn't you want to live on your own?
It's because I wanted so I can have a pet. So I can have good food, lots of nice support workers, stay up late. To stay up late when I want to stay up. Maybe around 9 or 10 or something like that. Then I like to go out, go shopping, and go out for dinner on Friday nights. I can invite people over for a party. We have a party in here.
As of 2013, Pearson still does not let its residents have pets. Daniel Gladstone lives in George Pearson Centre.
Well, I was lying on my futon at home watching the movie, and I got up to go get something out of the fridge and tripped over the loose rug and smacked my head on the coffee table. And I realized something was up because I couldn't move. And so I crawled over to the telephone. I phoned 911. And subsequently the fire department came and knocked down my front door and carted me away to St. Paul's Hospital. Then it was suggested to me that I go and look at this long-term resident care facility called George Pearson. So I said, okay, I'll go have a look. When they drove me there, they just left me there on the curb with my belongings and said, you're his problem now, and left me at George Pearson's doorstep. So that was my experience with the healthcare. What I can say is that the Pearson Institute, it's actually a hospital, is a place of sanctioned neglect of basic human needs, because I define needs as a level of dignity and a level of opportunity for hope to exist, and a possibility that there might be a brighter tomorrow. However, at George Pearson, nothing of the sort exists. You're just going to stay there until you expire before you were meant to because of the sanctioned neglect of that institution. The motto for Vancouver Coastal Health is people first. Which people?
Dr. David Ostro is the CEO and president in charge of the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority.
This is a question about long-term residential care facilities. Do you think that the ones that VCH controls allows people in them to live with freedom and dignity?
I think that's a rhetorical question. Yeah, I think they do, but obviously you have something behind your question which suggests you don't think they do.
Laurence Parent is a member of Regroupement des activistes pour l'inclusion au Québec, an advocacy organization of citizens with disabilities in Quebec.
So there's people who are losing the funding that they had and were forced to move in what we call here CHSLD, which is like kind of nursing homes, I guess. We don't call them like this, but in reality, I have been lucky enough to not live there, but I have friends who live there, and I know that it's like an hospital. Like a mix of hospital and prison, the same thing. And then it's not because people live there that they receive good services and good care. It's even sometimes the opposite, because you don't have any freedom to decide who will work for you. You receive services from the people who work in these big institutions. So you don't have a say. And I've heard stories of people who have been abused by workers and they complain, but the administration didn't believe them. So they were forced to continue to receive services from those abusive workers. And one time a woman even called the police, and the police came, but they were like, they didn't know how to react because it was not her home, it was an institution. So basically they told her, well, it's an administrative problem. She told them that she has been like physically abused, but they told her that it was an administrative problem. They didn't have anything to do. So even like the police is not there anymore to protect you. That's pretty scary.
Not having a way to enforce your civil rights determines what you're worth. Don Renault is a founding partner of the firm Campbell Renault Trial Lawyers and a founding member of the BC Wrongful Death Law Reform Group.
It's pretty much the state of the law in British Columbia that children and people with significant disabilities and the elderly can be killed through negligence. and there's no civil recourse. There are a lot of examples. They come up on a regular basis in the newspapers of individuals that are killed because of the wrongful actions of another, and there's no action for damages as a consequence. Those involve, as I said, children or elderly people or people with disabilities. One example that comes immediately to mind occurred in a care home in the Fraser Valley in the last year. It was a lady who was ventilator dependent, who had been sitting by the window enjoying the nice sunny day during the afternoon, and then was put to bed later that evening with the same ventilator. The difficulty is that the ventilator was battery charged. It did not have a power source that was guaranteed, and she simply ran out of batteries over the course of the night because the attendant failed to ensure that the ventilator was switched over and there was a reliable power source there over the course of the night. So that was a clear act of negligence on the part of the staff at the nursing home. But that was just something that gets reported in the newspaper, and there's no action for damages. And we hear of that, but I can't imagine how many other times these things take place. And they take place fairly often because that poor lady's life had no value under the eyes of the law. Under the eyes of the law, if an action had been commenced for damages, well, she could have ended up with a verdict, but there's no damages that would have been awarded because there's no meaningful wrongful death legislation in this province. So there was no action for damages, and that institution can carry on making mistakes like that with impunity.
The Secret Lives of Tough People. Paul Gauthier is the program coordinator of the BC Personal Support Network, a husband, a father of two, and a Paralympian.
You know, for me, the Paralympics has been an amazing experience to be able to represent Canada at 5 Paralympics now. In 2004 was the big year where it all began in Greece, Athens, Greece. It was just incredible with the gold in my individual competition. In growing up, I grew up in a group home setting. And when I was 18 and on the borderline of needing to move out of the group home, we started looking at what were the possibilities, where would I end up moving. And in my mind, I was always just going to move into my own place and receive the personal supports that I needed. At that point, I was told that the best option for me then was an extended care facility, George Pearson Center. And for me, that wasn't the move I wanted to make. I saw there were people out there in the community and they were getting the supports that they needed, and that's when I really had to learn the system, and that's when I learned that I needed to advocate for myself. It was a real wake-up call. And it also became the wake-up call of how the system was failing. Personal supports has been essential for me in my quest for gold, and also for the contributions that I've been able to make to the community. If it wasn't for home support, for example, and being able to get up in the morning and to be able to have my care and somebody assist me with my personal needs, I wouldn't be able to even get out the front door. Every day we don't know if those personal supports will be pulled away.
Canadians with disabilities do not have a right to personal supports. These personal supports can be eliminated at the sole discretion of civil servants at any moment.
If I didn't have the personal supports, for me it would be devastating. The only option I would have is to end up in an extended care facility. And I fear that, that is a real concern, that we can go backwards at any time.
In 2003, Kathy Grant received praise from the BC government for helping them create an agency, Community Living British Columbia, to meet the needs of people with developmental disabilities. In 2004, Kathy thought CLBC was going to harm people with disabilities, and she protested.
I protested and I sent a massive email out to everybody I knew at the time. Got some pretty good responses from a few people, but some very bad responses from other people. My advocate at that time phoned me and said, "You're making a lot of people in Victoria very nervous. Shut up." Because of the protests I made, those people have shunned me, and they don't talk to me anymore.
Ed Harkness is Kathy Grant's best friend.
Well, we volunteer here through our West Coast Railway Association. We tell everybody about the 374, the train that, pulled the first passengers into Vancouver, and we let the kids ring the bell, and and people who want to know more history or more about the locomotive. I love it. I love meeting new people. Kathy loves it, and it's a fun job. Kathy did not have service for 9 weeks, mainly because of CLBC. There was a situation that happened in her home, which got turned around to say that it was her and my fault. What happened was CLBC cut the contract to the service provider and said, "We don't have anybody and we won't be able to get you anybody for a couple of weeks." So I said, "Well, that's fine. I'll look after Kathy for a couple of weeks until you get it up running, and that's fine." Well, it never happened. It just kept going and going and going, and we had a meeting with them, and they were trying to take away her funding, and we were insistent upon that. She has funding. She has funding that was given to her when she came out of Pearson Hospital, and it's been misused and abused, and so has she in the process. And quite frankly, we want that funding, and we want control over it. We don't want the money in our hands, we want control over that.
Zosha Edberg is a polio survivor. In 2008, for overcoming her many challenges, she received a Courage to Come Back award. And she has a cute dog named Rumor.
I received a contract from Bayshore.
For many years, Zosha has received personal care in her home. In 2011, she received a new contract on how they would provide personal care to her.
And in the contract, it said that I needed to pay either per visit or per hour. And on it also said per assessment. I called them to find out what this was about. And they said, "Well, you got a letter from Fraser Health." I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, that's what we're referring to." I said, "But nothing on the letter calls it an assessment." So they said, "Well, that's what we're referring to." I said, "But on your contract it says per day, it says per hour or per visit. On that it says per day. I'm confused." And I said, "There's no figures on here." "Well, that doesn't matter. You just sign it and send it back." And I said, "No. Any lawyer would say, don't sign something that has no figures on it." I said, "Why don't you have any figures in here?" And they said to me, "Well, that's so we can change them whenever we need to." And I sort of looked at them and I said, "I rest my case. I'm not signing anything that doesn't have figures written on it." And they said, "Well, if you don't sign it, we'll withdraw services from you."
Choosing not to be a victim.
Learned helplessness is it's a concept that was developed in psychology, and the first experiments were done basically with animals, and they actually did things like they would electrify half the floor in a cage that a dog was in, and of course the dog would move to the part where he wasn't getting a shock anymore. And then they would electrify the entire floor, so unless the dog could fly, there was no way to escape from it. And what they discovered was if the dog was in a situation where they really couldn't escape from an aversive stimulus for a long enough time, they would just basically stop trying. And effectively, they became extremely passive and just allowed themselves to be shocked. Now, for people with disabilities who have been in institutional settings, etc., we also see the development of learned helplessness. And in the most extreme circumstances, it actually bears an amazing similarity to the experiments that they did with dogs in the 1970s.
After the psychiatrist left the room, and I was alone in my room with the door closed, I felt my world spinning, that my world was spinning out of control. Just 3 months before the psychiatrist made this threat to me, I was living in my own community, close to my friends, my family, where I had lived all my life. And 3 months later, the psychiatrist had made good on his threat and medicated me. I wouldn't be able to think for myself, which is what I was doing up to this point. And I thought, I didn't give in to the threat of the psychiatrist because I couldn't take the chance that anybody watching what was happening would think that my parents had raised. I didn't give in to the psychiatrist's threat because I couldn't take the chance that anybody watching what was happening would think that my parents had raised a coward.
In 1990, Americans with disabilities made their politicians pass a law to protect the civil rights of people with disabilities in the United States.
This is an immensely important day, a day that belongs to all of you. I just want to say your triumph is that your bill will now be law, and that this day belongs to you. And on behalf of our nation, thank you very, very much.
The Americans with Disabilities Act.
Countries like the States, they continue to improve things in terms of civil rights. We are forced to go at the Human Rights Commission, and it's a long process. Right now we have to fight every single obstacles, and this is the big difference, I think, between Quebec, Canada, and the United States. In the United States, at least they have this ADA, which address those kind of things. They don't have to fight for every single obstacles. That's the big difference, because in terms of like rights, our rights should be protected, but then there's no other law that support those rights. And I think, yeah, it's a big difference between Canada and the United States.
For me, the American with Disabilities Act is something that we need to be looking at here in Canada. We need to analyze it. We need to understand what's working and what's not working with it. But I believe that having something in place that gives people the right to personal supports, and if we can get that through a similar kind of American with Disability Act here in Canada, then I'd like to look at it.
Hope is not a plan.
In the course of fighting against the threats made to me by the psychiatrist, I got lucky. The man who threatened to kill me got arrested for threatening to kill people, and he was charged for uttering threats against me and many other people and criminal harassment. And eventually he copped a plea and entered into a minor form of restraining order. So when this man had been charged for threatening to kill other people, and me, I informed Coastal Health, the psychiatrist, in writing withdrew the diagnosis that I had a paranoid delusion that the man, that so-and-so had threatened to kill me because obviously I was telling the truth. I fought and worked every day to get out of Pearson, to make sure the health authority kept its promise to me. And it took 21 months of constant pushing the health authority to make them good, make them to live up to their commitments. And with some luck and the support of my family, I got out of Pearson after 21 months into a wonderful apartment of my own in Vancouver. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to get back to my home community where I had lived for 30 years at that point, but I did end up in a good place.
Individualized funding, for those that don't know about it, is very much where the dollars come directly to the individual, and they're the ones that are out there being the consumer and can actually purchase the product or the services that they require based on what their own needs are. So for me, home support wise, I'm able to become an employer. I am the employer. The Cecil program for me has changed my life because I'm able to have the person here when I want them to be here. I'm a family man, and for me it's really important to be able to have someone here that can support me in being, in my home and helping me with my care, but not interfering with my family time. And I've been able to find such caring, compassionate people. And the normal system normally has it that an agency is provided, that someone comes at a specific time. And quite often you never knew who that person was that was coming. And for me, it just wouldn't fit in with my life. And frankly, I don't see it fitting in with many people's lives. That individualized funding, if we actually looked at doing it across the board, not just for home support, but for everything, it'd be incredible how much money we would save, because I'm out there purchasing this service or products. I'd be out there looking for the best bang for the buck, and who can do that better than myself, who knows my care and who knows exactly what I need. I think the public generally thinks that people with disabilities are taken care of. And maybe I thought that when I was younger too. But the harsh realities became that if you can't live with the minimum, the so-called maximums, then extended care facilities was the only option.
As is, I think, obvious from my story and many of the other stories in Hope Is Not a Plan, the bottom line is that most people with disabilities do not have any leverage over the forces that supposedly meet their needs. When your civil rights are violated, you don't need a good hug, you need a good lawyer. The organization that I form with other people is called Civil Rights Now, and our goal is to get laws to give people with disabilities two things: control the money, the government money supposedly meeting their needs, to give them the leverage over the people providing those needs, and a law similar to the Americans with Disability Act. We need these two laws because hope is not a plan. We need these two laws to give people with disabilities control of the money and to get access to the courts, because hope is not a plan.
How many people do something they really believe in? I just wish people would realize that anything's possible. If you try, dreams are made. If people try. Terry Fox.